Welcome. I'm Eric Friedman, the Director of the Office of Consumer Protection. Did you know funerals are ranked among one of the most expensive purchases a consumer will ever make? In Maryland, the average funeral and burial costs close to $14,000. There are dozens of different goods and services. Some of them are required by law, others may be determined by religious customs, and others may be optional, but perhaps not really necessary. It's a complicated industry with a lot to know about. To help us sort it through, I've recently met with two experts in the death care industry, Brian Ditzler of the Maryland Funeral Consumers Alliance and David Goodman of the Maryland Office of Cemetary Oversight. Well, welcome, Brian and David. Thank you for taking time to be here. Now, this is really an important subject, not always the easiest thing to talk about, but clearly very important to consumers, so we appreciate your time. David, let's start with you. I understand you are the consumer member and the chair of the Advisory Council to Maryland's Office of Cemetary Oversight. Can you tell us a little bit, what is this Office of Cemetary Oversight? What does it do? What's its mission?
Okay, well, the Office of Cemetery Oversight was created back in 1997 when the General Assembly passed legislation to create in the Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation, which is located in Baltimore, an office that would be responsible for overseeing the operation of cemeteries in the state of Maryland. Now, it has jurisdiction over not every cemetery that operates. For instance, religious cemeteries are exempt. But commercial cemeteries, for-profit cemeteries, or nonprofits selling pre-need goods and services are under the jurisdiction of the office. And when the office was originally created, there was really no oversight over cemeteries. People really had no place to go if they had a problem with a cemetery. I can say with great confidence now that that's not the case. People can go to the office if they have a problem. The office has a number of responsibilities. One of them is to try to mediate conflicts when they arise between a consumer and a cemetery, and try to find solutions. Much of its work is focused on mediation. There are also greater responsibilities that involve the ethical and good operation of cemeteries, and to that extent, if there's a problem that arises where there's a pattern, they can get more deeply involved in trying to correct that when a cemetery is not behaving properly. And I can say that before the office existed, if you had picked up the Washington Post, almost every day there was a headline about a problem with the cemetery. And the office is going to be 15 years old in September. It's just going through a sunset review process in the General Assembly this session, and I'm pretty certain that that bill has passed and will be signed by Governor O'Malley soon, which will keep it operating for another 10 years. And the office is also a wonderful resource in terms of information and knowledge about, dealing with the death care industry, especially with cemeteries. It has a website, which I would strongly urge and recommend anybody to go and spend time studying. It has a consumer brochure that was developed in cooperation with the Board of Morticians and Funeral Directors that has excellent consumer tips. It also has a section dedicated to frequently asked questions, which has a lot of very good information.
So we have the cemetery, and I guess we can look at it as kind of two components when a loved one dies in terms of expenses, the cemetery and then actually the funeral. And so, Brian, I understand that you are a volunteer and vice president of something called the Maryland Funeral Consumers Alliance.
Yes.
And you help consumers with information, or can you tell us a little bit about what the organization does?
Yes, we are really consumer advocates. We're a consumer group that was pulled together nationally about 50 years ago, now called the Funeral Consumers Alliance. I'm with the regional chapter that supports Maryland, D.C., and Delaware. And our focus is consumer education and advocacy. We work to fight fraud and abuse in the funeral, burial, and cremation transactions. So my group actually follows cemeteries as well as funerals and cremations. And we stay very active in that. We have a very good website that consumers should look at to get lots of information about all aspects of cremation, funerals, burials. We actually had a bill sponsored this session of the General Assembly to address a problem that we had noticed that looks like it's going to get passed. And we supported another half dozen bills with the Board of Morticians and Funeral Directors that look like, most of which are going to get passed. So we are making progress.
So I understand several years ago the Federal Trade Commission looked at the funeral practices and came up with the funeral practices industry rule to deal with the problems.
My organization was a strong advocate of what became the funeral rule by the Federal Trade Commission, pushing them to do that. And there are a number of basic rules that will help, that a consumer should be aware of when they, that the Federal Trade Commission requires the funeral homes follow.
So I guess the kinds of decisions families have to make when a loved one dies is just like any other consumer purchase. You have to do some homework and ask the right questions.
Except this is one of the largest consumer purchases, because it's, by the time you add the cost of a typical funeral and an average burial, it can run the cost, can run $14,000, $15,000 the cost of a car.
Right.
And most people do a little research before they purchase a car. Well, similarly, they should do some research and learn their options before they decide what path they want to take for the funeral and burial if they decide to do that, or cremation if they want to go that route. My organization lets people be aware of far less expensive ways to do it if you're interested. It's good for people to know what their options are. For example, I said $15,000. One can also get away with spending $1,000 and that's it. Or you can spend nothing and have the body donated to medical science, which is what I'm going to do personally. So my family won't have to face the trauma of how to handle the body or pay a bill.
So what you're saying, like any consumer purchase, you have to do some homework and some research if you want to be smart before you actually need to make the purchase.
Very much so. Learn what your options are.
And the other aspect is what you said, which is that you don't want to be faced with those kinds of choices when you're emotionally not able to even think straight.
Right.
When you've just suffered a loss, when you're grieving, when you're in shock. The time to do that is, before the time of need.
Right.
So
Brian, when you go to a funeral home, how does the family know what things should cost?
You mentioned earlier the Federal Trade Commission's funeral rule. Some of the aspects of that funeral rule are that each funeral home has to provide a general price list to the consumer, and consumer is only has to buy what they want. They don't have to buy a package. Many of the funeral homes will encourage them to buy a package deal, but the consumer is only has to buy what they want. The funeral rule also specifies that once you've made your decisions, you have to get a very itemized bill so you know exactly what you're going to be getting, because the costs can easily add up if you don't realize what you're asking for. For example, many funeral homes will encourage you to embalm, which is not required by law. Most funeral homes will try to have you buy a casket. I mean, there are caskets sold in this area up to $125,000 for a casket. Yet one can buy a casket that's not shown. You have to ask the funeral director for it and say, I want a minimum pass casket. And they will have ones for under $1,000 that are made out of fiberboard. And for that matter, you can even have caskets of cardboard to minimize your costs. They don't like you to hear about those. Another option is the consumer, if they want to go the burial route, they can actually buy a casket online or from Walmart or Costco, and the funeral rule from the Federal Trade Commission specifies that the funeral home has to take the casket and not that you're providing them and not charge you a handling fee. Our website has a broad range of information on this, including actually a comparison of the prices of 264 funeral homes in the area that we went around a year ago and asked the funeral homes to provide us what their prices are. To give you an example of the value of shopping ahead of time, there's one funeral home in the Washington area that is used a lot because it's well known, it's been around for a while, and they trade on their reputation and they charge 6 times more than other funeral homes for the same services. Now, of course, they'll tell you they're better services the way they do them, but if you're concerned about cost, there's many ways that you can save money.
Right. I'm just thinking at the time of a death, though, this must be the hardest time in all that grief to try and do this sort of research. So
ideally, you've done it ahead of, as David said, ideally you've done it ahead of time. And actually, not only have you looked at your options, you've actually written them down and discussed it with your family members.
Right.
And for that matter, do it with your elderly parents so you know what they want. Because some unscrupulous funeral directors, I'm sure there are many responsible businessmen, just like there are in any, but there's also some that are not. And they will try the guilt trip and say, oh, you know, I can't imagine you not doing what's best for your loved ones as their final farewell, that you're not going to be willing to spend, you know, do what's right, and the bill can add up. I have friends that have spent $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 when if they'd done a little planning, they could have done it for far less.
So David, I guess there are additional expenses when you go to a cemetery. You know, we've heard this term perpetual care. Can you explain what that is?
So when a consumer goes to a cemetery that has perpetual care, that's one of the questions they would want to ask, whether they have a perpetual care trust account. But in the state of Maryland, and this varies from state to state, there's a simple formula that when you purchase a lot or a right of interment for burial in a cemetery, 10% of the cost of that lot will go into the perpetual care trust account. Now, a cemetery can put more in if they want, but the minimum that the law requires is 10%. Now, the idea is that there'd be a fund available for the upkeep and maintenance of that cemetery, you know, after it is no longer actively selling, you know, burial plots. And that includes the, you know, maintenance and upkeep of, you know, cutting the grass, the roads, the buildings, the structures. So that's actually one of the things that when a consumer is looking at a cemetery and considering it as an option, they really want to look at the overall condition of the cemetery, how it's managed and kept. They want to look at not just the front end, but they want to drive deeper into the cemetery and look in the back. And they want to even look at the perpetual care trust account. They can ask to see the report, to see what's actually set aside for, you know, the future. Whether it's adequate or not is something the consumer would have to make a judgment about.
And are there other rules that cemeteries typically have rules that consumers may or may not know about?
There are actually, you know, a lot of rules that cemeteries aren't necessarily going to, you know, make the consumer aware of right up front. But the consumer has to have enough knowledge to know what to ask. Funeral rule doesn't apply to cemeteries, but the statute that oversees cemeteries in Maryland requires that a general price list be given if a consumer asks for it. And you know exactly what each and every service and burial goods is going to cost from that price list. You can then go to another cemetery and do some comparison shopping and look at the rules and regulations. There are things like, you know, some people like to, you know, in addition to putting up a monument, you know, leave flowers or leave, you know, other, you know, memorabilia on a gravesite. And a cemetery may have rules or regulations against that. And unfortunately, consumers find out about that later on. So the important time to be making choices and decisions is before the time of need comes, because there's really no space to even think about all of those kinds of questions.
And David talked about the rules and regulations for cemeteries. I mean, what many people don't realize that once you've bought a cemetery plot, that's only the entree. Right. Because then you have to have an opening and closing fee. So there's $1,200, $1,500 just to dig the grave. Then they'll want to charge a fee for the apparatus that lowers the casket in. Then they'll charge another $1,500 for a so-called a cement vault or a casket liner. The concept being that they don't want from decay to have after a period of time for the casket and the body to sink, so they have a cement vault that keeps the ground at the same level, makes it easier to maintain the grounds. But there's another $1,200, $1,500 you hadn't thought of. There's a professional services fee you're always charged for a cemetery, for a burial. So
when you put the funeral costs and the cemetery costs together, you can very quickly get to $14,000 or more. Unless you do a more, you know, thoughtful process of really looking at and comparing. You know, it's being a good consumer, you know, and being an educated consumer is what makes the difference in terms of being able to make choices that bring down the cost, and hopefully at a time when you're not emotionally, you know, thrown by the loss, where you can really, you know, make decisions and
You know, Brian, in Montgomery County, we have a very diverse population with different customs, but we're hearing more and more about services that are not your traditional burial methods, so sort of green funerals, ashes being shot into space, freeze-dried sort of type of cremations. Are these new products that consumers need to think about and look into?
If that's what they're looking to do, there's lots of options always available. To go to the religious traditions, there are cemeteries that specialize in handling, or at least have a section that handle Jewish burials. There are a number of cemeteries that in the state that handle Muslim burials. For the latter, one would just need to look on the web, Google it, and you can find lots of those listed. They're usually associated with a mosque in the area. So far as cremation goes, that is an option that, interestingly, neither the Jewish or the Muslim accept. It is more. It's growing in popularity in this country. It's like 38–40% in this country. In some countries like Japan, I think it's up to 98%. Cremation offers a much less expensive process because you don't embalm. Of course, you don't have to embalm for burial either. You can have the cremains, as they call it, come back in what they call a minimum container. So you don't have to buy an urn. The minimum container is a cardboard box with a sealed bag in it, and one can get a cremation for $800, $1,200. You don't even need to buy a casket for that. They'll cremate in a cloth bag or cardboard. So it really is a less expensive way. And a lot of people prefer it because then they can take the ashes and do with it. They can shoot it into space. There's one option is some people are having it put into a formation where it's dropped in a reef so the fish can be around it, and or one can just take the ashes back. And I had my in-laws, my mother and father-in-law, sitting in boxes on a shelf in our family room, and it was actually very comforting to my wife for a while. So that is one option that one can take. Green burial essentially is when you don't have a casket, you don't have embalming, and you're buried in a cloth shroud in a cemetery. There's not many places. I've heard there may be one or two places in the state that may have a portion that does green burial, but there are not very many places that do that.
Okay, interesting. Now, David, tell us about cremations with respect to cemeteries. Are there new laws, or how does that work?
Okay, so actually last year the General Assembly passed new legislation allowing for oversight of crematories in the state of Maryland. And it is a pretty unique bill in that crematories exist both at cemetery locations as well as at funeral homes and even other sites that are not tied to either part of the industry. So the Office of Cemetery Oversight has been working very closely with the Board of Morticians and Funeral Directors over the past year to go to the next step, which is to actually put together regulations that would include codes of ethics and practice requirements for crematories that would have to be followed. And they were just recently in March posted on the Maryland Register. It's now open for public comment, and once it finishes that process, there will actually be regulations in place for both the Office of Cemetery Oversight and the Board of Morticians to administer. It's interesting that in Maryland, the Department of Vital Statistics has been keeping records of how many people in the state of Maryland choose cremation as an option. And it's been increasing about 1% a year. More recently, maybe partly due to economic conditions, it's bumped up to 35% now of Maryland consumers are choosing cremation. That trend actually put pressure on the General Assembly to come up with a resolution to include cremation as a part of the industry that's under oversight, has a watchdog over it.
Right. Now there's so much more that we could talk about. Brian, if you could give us leave us with one or two words of wisdom in terms of helping consumers with their funeral arrangements, what would you suggest?
Well, as we've talked about earlier, I think the most important thing is to learn what your options are beforehand, figure out how much you want to spend, talk about it with your family members, and then write down a plan, but not only for them, but for you. And oftentimes, you might find that it's surprising that the loved one is happy to do approach A versus what you thought approach B, and maybe approach A is a lot less expensive. So just think about it ahead of time, do your research, and come up with a written plan.
Good advice. And David, words of wisdom when it comes to choosing a cemetery?
I guess what you don't know can hurt you. And the Office of Cemetery Oversight, Brian's website, the Board of Morticians, all have information that is essential for making good decisions in terms of the death care industry. I think it's important for consumers to know that there's tremendous competition for their dollar. There are different parts to the death care industry. We talked about the funeral side and the cemetery side. There's also the monument dealers. There's also cremation. It's really essential, that consumers have a sense, that there's a lot of competition out there. They can make good choices. Funerals and cemetery costs don't have to be astronomical. They can be reasonable, but you have to do your homework. And the only other thing that I would say is that if a consumer at any time has a problem, with any part of the industry, there's a place to turn now.
Well, a difficult consumer protection subject perhaps, but very, very important. So thank you, gentlemen, for sharing this wealth of information.